It's late at night, you can't sleep, you know you need to rest, but your brain just won't stop worrying and ruminating. The clock's ticking, but you're just falling deeper and deeper into a vicious cycle where things seem increasingly frustrating. You start questioning your life decisions, and that inner voice just won't shut up. Okay, if this sounds familiar, then you know exactly what it means to be stuck in the downward spiral of what psychologists call repetitive negative thinking. This video is going to show you why your brain does this, plus later we'll look at a powerful strategy for exiting this loop and quieting your mind. Okay, here's the most important thing to understand about this entire topic. Rumination can become a habit. But that raises a question. Why would your brain turn something so unpleasant into a habit? Okay, so to answer that, we need to consider what makes us ruminate in the first place. And to do that, we need to delve into the hexagon. In a 2020 paper, the psychologists Edward Watkins and Henrietta Roberts proposed a model to explain a specific subtype of repetitive negative thinking, rumination. Now, rumination is repetitive negative thinking about yourself, your feelings, your problems, or upsetting experiences. And it's often where you're focusing on the causes, meaning, and consequences of those. So instead of asking productive questions like, how can I learn from that experience so I can improve the next time around, we think about how we feel, why we feel that way, and what it says about us or life in general. It's the kind where we magnify our flaws and become increasingly hopeless. Now, Watkins and Roberts proposed 5 interacting mechanisms that help explain why rumination begins, how it becomes habitual, and how it remains so difficult to stop. They referred to this with the acronym HEXAGON. Now, the H, the first letter, stands for habit, and it's essentially what ties everything else together. The other 4 factors are executive function, abstract thinking, goal discrepancy, and negative biases. So let's walk through a scenario to see how all these factors interact. So say you have an important presentation at work. You go into the meeting and start going through your slides when you realize that you forgot to prepare the most important piece of the report. Your brain detects a threat, right? And that begins preparing your body for action. You start to sweat, your heart's beating out of your chest, your mouth gets dry, and it makes everything harder. You can't even speak, right? You barely get through this presentation. You slump down in your seat and you just hope that everybody forgot what just happened. Now the GO, the GO in hexagon, stands for goal discrepancy, which is the difference between your current state and a specific goal. In this case, your goal was to give a great presentation, which you didn't do. So this feels awful, right? At this point, you're not feeling good, but you have a choice about how to interpret those feelings. The first option is you can see it as a sign that you should adjust your behavior in the future. Now, this offers concrete steps, right? You can solve the problem. You can say, I'm going to set a reminder to double check my slide deck before every meeting. Or you can interpret those feelings as signs of something bigger, something more ominous, right? You start thinking, maybe it's not just a mistake. Maybe I'm the kind of person who just can't succeed. Maybe I'm fundamentally flawed. And that's a scary thought. So your brain, right, it tries to figure out if it's true. Now, the problem is that question isn't concrete or straightforward. And if it somehow is true, then what's the solution? And this is where the A in hexagon comes in. Okay, so A stands for abstract thinking style. And this is opposed to concrete thinking style. So when you ask, how do I prevent this from happening in the future? You're thinking concretely. But if you ask, what does this say about my fundamental character? You're beginning to think abstractly. And now the ambiguity and the abstract nature of that question push your brain to try to assess the evidence and figure out the answer. So the truth is, many of us have a strong negativity bias, especially when it comes to thinking about ourselves. So for those of us who do, it's much easier to remember failures, personal shortcomings, those kinds of things, rather than successes and strengths. And so this is why the N in hexagon stands for negativity bias. When our brain starts searching for evidence about whether we're fundamentally flawed, right, it easily finds examples, okay, which seems to confirm that idea. And this is where rumination gets much, much darker. So the problem is that we're stuck in this loop, right? If we could just shift our attention, distract ourselves, do something, we might be able to get out of the cycle. But that's where the final hexagon factor comes in. the EX, which stands for executive function. Now, executive function depends on control networks that are distributed in the brain and include areas like the lateral prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex. And they help us to shift our attention, to inhibit habitual responses, to regulate emotions, to hold goals in mind, and to choose what we think next. In other words, those are many of the abilities that we need to get out of an overthinking cycle. But before we get to how to do that, we need to answer the question we posed earlier. If, rumination, repetitive negative thinking, if this is so unpleasant, why do our brains make a habit out of it? One reason is that it can feel productive, right? It sort of feels like we're uncovering some deep, dark truths that might be important to recognize. Yet very often, it's just not that deep. Yes, it feels like we're making progress on the problem in our head, but we're actually making it harder because we can't move forward because rumination distracts us from solving the actual problems that are in our way. And the thing is, once we've engaged in this pattern multiple times, right? Just failure or stress or low mood, these things can all trigger us to go back down that rabbit hole of overthinking. Okay, but now that we understand what's going on, let's talk about how to break the cycle. So just as a quick preview of what we're going to go through in just a second, here's kind of my suggestion for a strategy, a 3-step strategy for weakening repetitive negative thinking. So step 1 is to set more workable goals. 2, train your inner awareness. And 3, practice a different response. And at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about what I see as kind of a bonus step that may help you to get out of this cycle once it's already begun. So step 1, set more workable goals. This first step is to recognize that some of your goals may actually be impossible to achieve. I'm not here talking about ambitious goals that are just unlikely or really challenging. No, here I'm talking about truly impossible goals. Things like, I should never make a mistake, right? My work needs to be perfect. I should never disappoint anyone. I should always feel happy and never experience negative emotions. And this is precisely the type of goal that will leave you disappointed, right? Because you will always, or at least repeatedly, fail to achieve it. And if you hold goals like this, you're essentially setting up your brain to dive headfirst into that downward spiral of habitual thinking. So one useful approach is to translate an abstract demand into specific, realistic, and actionable next steps. So what I mean here are SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound goals. So instead of saying, I must never embarrass myself during a presentation, you might say, before my next presentation, I'm going to review the slide deck the evening before, 30 minutes before the meeting, right? That doesn't guarantee success, but it gives you a real-world, concrete problem to solve instead of just an impossible standard that you judge your self-worth by. Okay, now step 2, train your awareness. Step 2, you got to learn to observe your thinking, your emotional reactions in real time, right? Many people don't really recognize what's going on in their bodies and minds, so it can be challenging to see when they've crossed over from what is genuinely helpful problem solving into unhelpful rumination and worry and the repetitive negative thinking cycle that we're talking about. Okay, so a useful question to ask is, am I arriving at a clearer decision or action, or am I asking the same abstract questions, arriving at the same black and white statements over and over again? Now, to notice that crossover point, we need to train our minds before this kind of cycle happens. And one way to do this is with mindfulness meditation. So this involves just noticing thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations as they occur without judgment and without getting pulled into them. And then when attention does become captured, right, you just practice noticing that and then gently redirecting your attention away. So mindfulness not only trains awareness, right, but also the ability to recognize when the mind is entering into a familiar pattern. Now, awareness is great, but awareness of our internal states alone isn't going to break that repetitive negative thinking habit. So step 3 is to practice a different response. To actually weaken a habit, you have to engage in a different response, a different behavior in response to the cue compared to the old habit. So for example, if you notice yourself asking, what is wrong with me? Why can't I ever succeed? You can deliberately replace that question with, what's the next concrete action I can take? What's the lesson I can learn from this experience? What did I gain from this experience? Now, in the moment, that can feel super counterintuitive, right? It can feel uncomfortable, almost like we're abandoning an important problem, right? But if we can just ride out that discomfort, we might find ourselves lifted out of that downward spiral and back onto solid ground. So I just suggest, testing these 3 steps. Try this out for yourself, right? Set more workable goals, train your awareness, practice a different response. That's kind of my core strategy for reducing unhelpful, repetitive, negative thinking. But I mentioned earlier that there's this 4th tool, and it's something that I recently found incredibly helpful. In fact, I feel like I recently, quote unquote, discovered it in myself. But before I get to that, I just want to mention, right, this strategy might be helpful, but some of us experience really extreme forms of repetitive negative thinking. And if that describes you, I strongly suggest that you seek help from a therapist. And trust me, from personal experience, I'm speaking from experience here, having a therapist who can understand you, understand what you're going through, and work with you over a period of time, that can be a massive game changer for your mental health. Okay, so with that in mind, let's turn to this 4th, bonus step. Okay, so recently I had one of the worst bouts of overthinking I have ever experienced. I couldn't sleep, right? My mind was just revving up about everything that was going wrong in my life, and I just descended into this dark state, right? There was hopelessness, serious anxiety, and as the night went on, I became increasingly sleep deprived, which of course made me more anxious about, what's going to happen tomorrow. I need sleep. But it also, I think, kind of impaired my executive functions, made it harder for me to redirect my attention, to change, the contents of what I was thinking about. And I even tried to just ride it out, just observe that discomfort, let it go. But I just kept going back. I kept digging a little deeper again and again and again. But what finally broke the spell was something that was totally unexpected. I heard a small voice in the back of my mind, and it kind of whispered to me, right? It sounded really different from the other voices that were kind of screaming in my head. It was calm, it was confident, right? I tried to listen to it, and what it said was really surprising. It said, "I'm going to take care of you. I'm here for you. Everything's going to be okay." And I'm not kidding. Suddenly, my emotional state just shifted on a dime. And of course, this voice was part of me, right? It was the part of me that knew that all of what I was talking about with everything's going to fall apart, that was all nonsense, right? That I would be able to handle the challenges that came my way. And so the crucial moment came when I allowed myself to stop searching for an answer. I trusted this voice. I let go and, said, hey, I'm not going to solve everything tonight, but I know it's going to be okay. Try asking yourself what a calmer, wiser version of yourself would say. Right? You don't have to believe that voice without question, right? You don't have to just take it on faith. You just have to give it enough space to interrupt that loop. Because sometimes that alone may be enough to remind you that you don't need to solve your whole life tonight. To all of you who are supporting Sense of Mind on Patreon or as YouTube members, thank you so much. So please consider going to patreon.com/senseofmind or becoming a member by clicking the join button below this video. If you get anything out of these videos, please give it a like and subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.